In this video, you're going to learn about two main checkboxes, and those are layer mask shapes effects and vector mask shapes effects. What do they do? You'll find out. But we're going to go much deeper than looking at just those two. Now, first, what the heck might I do with this? Well, here's just an example. Let's say you have two objects. They're on two separate layers, and you want them to look like they're intertwined, where usually an object is either on a layer above or the layer below something else. But in this case, these layers look like they kind of weave in between each other. And in fact, if you look, you'll see where one object is on top of the other, there's a little drop shadow that falls right on that other object. And if you look at the drop shadows in general, they're much cooler than what you usually get out of Photoshop. So you'll learn about all that stuff. So let's dive in and see how it works. So let's recreate this from scratch. And you'll get the interesting shadows, the interaction, and you'll be able to move things around just like this as well. So let's start by creating a brand new document. I'm just going to make a document. I don't care the size, and hit create. There we go. Then I will grab the shape tool. And with the shape tool active, I can change my foreground color to whatever I want for my shape. This color is fine. And up here at the top of my screen, I'm going to say to make a shape instead of paths or pixels. Then right here, I'm just going to click and drag. And while I'm dragging, I'll hold Shift to constrain my proportions to a square. And let's say that's good enough. Now, in this case, it ignored my foreground color. That's because there was a color specified up here already, and you can see it also on the right side of my screen. So I currently have a white box on a white background. If you look down here in my layers panel, you'll see that. To change the color, you can either double click on the thumbnail image for this layer or click right here where it says fill, and you can choose a color, or you could click right here and get your color picker to choose any color you want. Well, I'm going to go for this orange color right here that I've used in the past. Now that's a big solid square. Now what I'd like to do is poke a hole in the middle of it. And I'm going to do that by using the exact same tool once again. But with default settings, if I use that tool again, it might create a brand new layer. Instead, I'm going to go up here in my options bar at the top of my screen, and I'm going to choose a choice other than new layer. For now, I'm going to choose combine shapes because I don't want to change what this particular shape is already doing. So let's just choose that, and now I'm going to draw a brand new shape. I'm just going to click and drag like this. And if I need it to be a square, I'll hold Shift, which I'm doing right now. And if I want to reposition it, I press the space bar and drag until I get it exactly where I want. I'm looking at the upper left corner. When I like exactly where it is, I let go of the space bar, and then I can resize it again and get it to be exactly what I'd like. Now, this is two rectangles on top of each other, but they're both filled in. So I'll go right back up here to the top, and I'm going to now say this inner shape should subtract from the other shape. So now it's creating a hole in that. So if you look at my layers panel, you'll see it here. We have a rectangle, and you'll see the middle doesn't exist. Now let's end up with a second one of those. So what I want to do now, I want to duplicate this layer, but right now that inner section is selected. So if I duplicate something, it'll likely only duplicate the middle. So let's just switch between that layer and the one below it and right back again so that it has everything selected. And then I'll go up here and choose layer, new, layer via copy, or I usually just type Command J, Control J in Windows, but that should make an exact copy of the layer. If you look at my layers panel, you'll see the new one. Then let's use the move tool and let's reposition that one down here. And let's come up here into our properties and let's change its color. I'll just click right here and I'm going to choose a yellowish color for that one. You can choose any color you'd like. Now what I'd like to do is somehow make it look as if the two are intertwined so that this yellow shape here looks as if it goes underneath the other shape right in this area. Now I'm going to do that using a layer mask. If I use a layer mask, we're going to end up hiding part of this layer. So let's add a layer mask right now. I'll click on the layer mask icon while that topmost layer is active. And then I don't want to do too much work because I think Photoshop can help me here. I want to only hide the yellow object right here. And so there's a way to get a selection out of the layer that's below. What you do is go into your layers panel And if you look close at that layer that's below, you can put your mouse right on top of its thumbnail. You can hold down the Command key, Control in Windows, and click anywhere within this thumbnail. And if you do, it's going to select anything that doesn't look like a checkerboard. So when I Command click there on a Mac, which would be Control clicking in Windows, you see the selection that I ended up with. Well, I'm working on the other layer, the yellow one, and I had earlier added a layer mask. Now let's actually fill in some of that layer mask. I'll grab my brush tool and I'm going to paint with black. And I'm just going to paint right here where I don't want that area to show up. Once I've done that, I can get rid of my selection. So I'll simply go up here and choose deselect. And if you look at what we have, it now looks as if that yellow object is kind of intertwined with the other one. It goes above it in one spot and below it in another, even though if you look at my layers panel, it's obviously completely above it. It's just this layer mask here is making it so it will be hidden in some areas. So then let's see if we can make this look a little bit more dimensional. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by working on this layer that contains the yellow box. And I'm going to go down here to the letters FX and I'm going to add a gradient overlay. With my gradient overlay, I'm going to set it here to the mode called multiply. And I'll come down here and explore the various settings for my gradient. If I were to click on this, I could choose whatever shade that I want to fade out to white. I've just chose a light shade, something that is a little bit darker than white, fading out to white itself. In multiply mode, it acts like ink, so it can only darken things. And let's see what that's doing. I'll turn the preview checkbox off, and you'll see here versus there. You see how it's darkening that rectangle a bit. Although I think it should really darken it where it should look like it's below, which would be here. So there's a checkbox here called reverse. I'm going to turn that on so it really darkens it in that area. Therefore, the lower portions have been darkened. Let's click OK. Let's do the same thing for the other rectangle. Now that rectangle here is on top, at the top of it, and is underneath, below. So let's go back down to the letters FX after clicking on that layer, and let's again choose Gradient Overlay. And this time we'll set it to multiply once again, and we'll just turn reverse off, because it remembers the last settings you used, and therefore the bottom portion of this one will get darkened, and that'll help give it the feeling that it is going below. All right. Then, though, I think we should have some drop shadows. I think this yellow object right here should make a drop shadow that falls onto the warm colored object that is there. So let's go up to that yellow object and let's come down here to the letters FX and let's choose drop shadow. And when you're in drop shadow, you can click and drag within your picture to move this around. And I'm just going to position it right about there. And you can fine tune the settings. Opacity controls how dark it is. And let's see, size controls how soft the edge is. Those are the two main things you'll need to work with. And then I'll click OK. But we have some issues here. If you look at it and you look at the shape, it looks fine right there. But once we get up to here, the drop shadow just doesn't look right. And there's a gap right there. And that's because we're thinking visually that this looks like it's going underneath this. But in reality, if you look in the layers panel, that yellow object is actually on top, and this layer mask is just hiding part of it. And the fact that there's a layer underneath that contains anything is largely irrelevant when it comes to that drop shadow. If we were to turn off the layer that's underneath, you get a better idea for what we really have. But I want to use a special feature. What I want to do is get this layer mask to not only hide the layer that it's attached to, but to also hide the effects, the drop shadow and any gradient overlay. So to do that, with this layer active, I'm going to go down to the letters FX. I'm going to choose the very top option, and that's where I'm going to find a choice called Layer Mask Hides Effects. Now watch what happens when I turn that on. Remember, we have a layer mask. It has some black in it right about here, and black hides the layer. So when I turn on Layer Mask Hides Effects, it also is hiding now that drop shadow, which is appropriate. By the way, there's also another choice called Vector Mask Hides Effects. A vector mask is just like a layer mask. The only difference is a layer mask is made out of pixels, like what you paint with, and a vector mask is made out of paths, like what you make with the pen tool. So we aren't using vector mask in this case for what we need to do, so I'm going to use the layer mask option. Well, now that we have the drop shadow properly hidden, if I turn on the layer that's underneath, now we have some of that feeling where here we have the drop shadow and I can see it hitting this area, and then we come up here and it does disappear nicely, so it feels as if it's going underneath. But now let's learn about other features that will let us get a little more sophisticated. If we have this yellow object casting a shadow onto this one, then when it gets up here, shouldn't this object here, the orangish one, cast a shadow onto the yellow one? Well, let's see if we can get that to happen. Well, let's just take the drop shadow that's already on the yellow one and we can move it down to the orange. The only thing is if you just drag it down there, it's going to move it instead of copy it. If you hold down the Option key, Alt and Windows when you drag, it will move a copy. So I'm just going to hold Option, drag it down there, and now I have my drop shadow. Well, the problem is we have that drop shadow coming out here all the way around, but I don't see it right there. And the reason I don't see it right there is if you look in my Layers panel, look at where the orange object actually is. Is it not underneath the yellow one? So how can it cast a shadow onto it? Well, we're going to have to get a little bit fancy to do that. So let's learn about some other features. Just to simplify things, I'll click this little arrow to collapse down the effects on the two layers that we have. Then I'm going to take this orange layer and I'm going to duplicate it. I could go up and use the same menu choice I used originally to duplicate a layer, but I'll use the keyboard shortcut for it, which is Command J. Control J in Windows. So now we just have a duplicate. And what I'm going to do is tell Photoshop to take these effects that we have applied to that particular layer and make them as separate independent layers. So I'll go up here to the layer menu. I'm going to choose Layer Style, and you're going to find a choice called Create Layers. And that's going to take however many layer styles we have and reproduce them as separate layers. So let's choose that. It'll always warn you that some effects can't be done, but most of the time they can be done just fine. You click OK, and now let's see what we've gotten. Let me close up the properties up here so we can see our layers a little better. So here's that duplicate we made that has the same orangish shape. Above it is our gradient. If I turn that on and off, you can see it getting brighter and darker. I don't need that gradient, and I don't even need the layer that contains the shape, because remember, this was a duplicate. I'm just going to take these two layers and throw them away. The other thing we got is this layer. This is the actual drop shadow. Well, I want to take that drop shadow and I want it to fall on the yellow object. So I'm going to drag this particular layer on top of my layer stack. So I'm just going to drag it up here on the very top. So now you can see it falling onto the yellow object right there. The problem is it's also falling on other objects that are underneath, including the orange one. So I want to do something to get that particular drop shadow to only fall on this yellow object. I can do that with this drop shadow layer active. As long as it's directly above the yellow one, I'm going to go up to the layer menu and I'm going to choose Create Clipping Mask. That means make this layer only show up where there's something on the layer below. So when I choose it, now it has clipped our drop shadow to that yellowish layer. I'll turn off its eyeballs so you can see what it looked like without, and turn it back on and see what it looks like with. And you can see it's adding that nice little drop shadow. The only problem is, right here it's also adding it, and that doesn't look appropriate. So let's just add a layer mask. I'll click on the layer mask icon, and I'm going to come over here with my paintbrush, and I'll paint with black right there to just say hide it. So now if you look at our two shapes, it looks to me like they're somewhat intertwined. Where here the yellow shape goes on top of the orange one, it casts a drop shadow onto it. And then it comes up here, goes underneath, and where it goes underneath, the orange object is casting a shadow onto the yellow one. So it gives us that illusion that the two are intertwined. And the thing that made that work out was the layer mask hides effects on this area up here. But now it's not going to quite work if I want to be able to click on one of these layers and use the Move tool and reposition it. Because look at what just happened. We ended up this hole, that's just a layer mask. It's not attached to the layer I just moved. And so it didn't move with this. So let's choose Undo. So we've learned a little bit, but we need to get fancy now. Now you can drop off at any time if I get to be too much here, but if it's not too much, let's get in here and actually get fancy with our layers. Let's see what I can do. Well, if I'm moving this around, I really wish other layers would move with it. First off, let's get the drop shadow that is falling on the yellow box to move with it. Because right now if I move over, you see that drop shadow did not move with it. So here's the layer with the orange thing. Up here is the drop shadow. Let's make both of those layers active. I'll hold down the Command key, Control and Windows, and I'll click up there at the top. Then I'm going to come to the bottom of my layers panel and I'm going to click the link icon. That's a little chain symbol. When you click the link icon, then you no longer have to have both of these layers active at the same time. You can have either one of them active, and then any layers that have the link turned on means they're going to move together. So now if I move this orange object, we got one part fixed, and that is this little part here that puts a drop shadow on the yellow one will move with it. But we got another problem. Watch what happens when I move this. First, notice that little drop shadow is there, but this hole in the yellow thing is not moving. Why is that? Well, let's figure out what's making that hole. Is it not this layer mask right here? That's what's hiding the yellow box to make it look as if the orange one is on top. And I need to do something that lets that move at the same time or anytime I move this orange box. And right now it's not because it's attached to this layer. Well, we're going to have to get triply fancy to do that. Let's figure out how it's done. Well, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to get a selection out of this. You can get a selection out of this by holding down the Command key, Control and Windows, and clicking on this mask. And when you do, you get a selection of all the areas that are white. That means I got all the areas out here. I actually want the opposite of that, so I'm going to choose Select Inverse. And then I'll have the opposite, which is just the area I want to hide. Now, since we're going to use something else to hide that area, let's come up here to the layer mask, and I'm just going to drag it to the trash can. And if it asks me a question, I'll just say delete. Sure. Now that area became visible once again where that little area was, but we're now going to use a different feature to poke a hole through the yellow box because we need something that will move along with the orange one. So let's get fancy. To get really fancy, let's create a brand new empty layer on the top of our layer stack. There we go. And we have that selection active. Let's end up adding a layer mask so that the selection gets converted into a layer mask. Now this is just an empty layer and we have a layer mask on it. And now let's do something to get whatever's in that layer mask to poke a hole through what's down here. How the heck do we do that? Well, in other lessons, we have covered a feature where if I go down to the letters FX and I choose blending options, you have a choice right here called knockout. And there you can knock out shallow or deep. I'm going to knock out shallow and click OK. Now, what does knockout shallow do? It says wherever this layer would usually be visible, it should knock a hole through all layers that are underneath that are inside the same group. A group looks like a folder, and we don't currently have one of those. So let's make one. I'm going to take this layer, which is going to poke a hole through things, and the next two layers down and get them selected. So I'll hold Shift and I'll click down here. Then I'll click the folder icon. That gives us a group. So now if knockout shallow knocks a hole through everything that's in the same group, then this thing should knock a hole through this and this. And that should do what we need it to. But we have one problem, and that is it usually figures out where it should knock things through based on the transparency of this layer. And that means wherever it looks like a checkerboard, it wouldn't do anything. Well, this is an empty layer, so the entire layer is transparent. How the heck can we change that? Well, I've covered it in other videos if you've been following along, although I doubt you've been watching them all. Let's get it to work. Let's go down here to the letters FX. Let's choose blending options. And let's turn off this checkbox called Transparency Shapes Layer. And that's because there's nothing in this layer. So if the transparency of the layer is going to shape where it thinks it's showing up, it thinks this is empty. But if I turn off Transparency Shapes Layer, then it's going to think the layer mask shapes it. So let's do that. Click OK. All right, now it's actually poking a hole through things just like I want it to. And not quite done yet. We got to now make sure this moves when we need it to. So let's see. If I have this orange thing, and if I currently move it, you see how the hole didn't move along with it? Well, what's making the hole? Let's choose undo. This layer. So what I want is my orange layer to move. I also want this layer, which is already linked to it, which is the shadow, and this layer, which is poking the hole. I'm just holding on the Command key in a Mac, Control in Windows to select those, and let's link them all. There we go. We got those three linked together. So now if I use the Move tool, check it out. I can move this orange box wherever I want it, and it looks as if, in general, it is doing what we need. The only problem is when I move it a certain amount, you see right down in this area, suddenly there's a shadow showing up. And the reason for that is we had a shadow that we hid at one point, and it was hid with this layer mask. Let me choose undo so we haven't moved it. And right now, anytime this shadow is moving, that mask is moving. And I don't want the mask to move when the shadow does. So all I need to do is click this little link symbol to turn it off. So now that means if I move this shadow, don't move this with it. Only move the shadow and let that still hide where it shows up. Now this, I only painted in a small area. I might need to paint in a wider area, but we should be able to start moving this around a good amount now. So now I got this drop shadow is in there. It's clipped to a layer. We got this hole, and it looks as if these two are nicely intertwined. And we got a bunch of fancy stuff going on here. We got everything from linked layers, which is this chain symbol, to a layer set to knock out shallow with another setting that is transparency shapes layers turned off, which lets the layer mask shape it. And we got that layer linked to something else. And we got that layer linked to something else. But when I showed you the original version of this, my shadows look much fancier than this. How the heck can I get those fancier shadows? Well, let's find out. I'm going to take one of these layers that is our shape. I'll take the orange one, and I'm going to duplicate it by typing Command J. And I'll take what's underneath, and I'm going to turn off our drop shadow. I'm just going to go over here and drag the drop shadow to the trash so we can create a brand new one that's fancier. Then I'll do the following. I'm going to go to the plugins menu. Now your plugins menu might not be as long as mine because you have to install plugins to get them to show up here. But notice I have one called Shadowify 2. Now, if you want to find the Shadowify 2 plugin and download it, you'll have to go to Browse Plugins. That's going to launch your Creative Cloud app. And it should take you to a section called Stock and Marketplace, and then should highlight this area called Plugins. And this is where you can search for various plugins to add to Photoshop. But if you're going to search, don't use the magnifying glass up here, because that won't search just for plugins. Instead, go to the left side and right down here, search all plugins. And that's where I type in Shadowify and just press return. And there you'll find Shadowify 2. Now, Shadowify 2 is a paid plugin, but I do find it to be very useful for creating much more realistic drop shadows. I was given a free copy of it, but otherwise have no association with these guys whatsoever. And this is where I ended up getting my copy. So if you come in here and over on the right, you'd usually be able to purchase the plugin if you'd like. But once you do and you install this, you're going to be able to choose drop shadow. And then instead of having the simple controls that Photoshop presents you with when adding a drop shadow, you're going to be able to create something that's much more sophisticated. Just as with Photoshop drop shadows, you'll be able to choose the angle, you'll be able to choose the distance, and you'll be able to choose the opacity. But now we have a general opacity and an end opacity. So end opacity controls how dark it is at the end of that drop shadow, where it's pretty much done, whereas the normal opacity controls how dark it is near the subject. We also then have Other controls in here for distance and steps controls how smooth of transition do you get between this. But once you get these dialed in, watch what happens if I hit the Create Shadow choice. And before I do, let me hide the shadow on that layer that's above so you can see what we're replacing. We're replacing this one on the orange because I duplicated the orange and I threw away shadow. So I'm just going to hit Create Shadow. Watch what happens in my Layers panel. It just did a bunch of work to create a very sophisticated shadow, but it actually used Photoshop's techniques to do so. Check it out. If I open this little folder that it made, what do we have? Well, here we have a shape that is just like the original one that we were using. And then look, it added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 drop shadows right there, all with slightly different offsets, slightly different blurs. Then down here, it added 10 more. And down here, it added 5 more. And that's because the number of steps it was set to was 25. So it ended up using a total of 25 of Photoshop's drop shadows to create this much more sophisticated drop shadow effect. So if you're still with me now, then you're pretty darn good with Photoshop because most people after the first few things would drop off. So I really appreciate you. And if so, stick around because I end up getting deeper into Photoshop than most people because I've used Photoshop for about 30 years now and it's pretty much all I use. So stick around and take a look at these videos, and I hope to see you again. My name is Ben Wilmore from Digital Mastery and Masters Academy.